Billionaire pays homeless woman for a child, then is shocked by what he sees at birth. Before we dive into the story, share in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Life has a strange way of bringing people together, of weaving destinies that seem worlds apart into one remarkable story. This is the tale of two souls. Alexander Pierce, a man who had everything money could buy but nothing that truly mattered, and Sarah Collins, a woman who had lost everything except her dignity and her dreams. Alexander Pierce stood at the window of his penthouse office, 60 stories above Manhattan, his empire spread out before him like a concrete kingdom. At 45 he had amassed a fortune of $30 billion, built a tech empire that spanned continents, and yet, he had never felt more alone. The doctor's words still echoed in his mind, "Mr. Pierce, you have less than 5 years." A rare genetic condition was slowly destroying his body, and without an heir, his entire legacy would crumble. That morning, as his chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce glided through the city streets, Alexander saw her. Sarah Collins sat on a worn cardboard box, her clothes threadbare but clean, her eyes holding a spark that poverty hadn't managed to extinguish. She was reading to a group of homeless children, her voice carrying stories of hope to those who needed it most. Something about her stopped him cold. Maybe it was the gentle way she handled those children, or perhaps it was the quiet dignity she maintained despite her circumstances. Alexander had his driver circle the block 3 times before he finally made his decision. He stepped out of the car, his Italian leather shoes touching the cracked sidewalk, and approached her with an offer that would change both their lives forever. $1 million, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need an heir, and I need someone who understands the value of life beyond money. Carry my child, and the money is yours." Sarah looked up at him, her green eyes sharp with intelligence and wariness. She didn't immediately answer, didn't jump at the money like he expected. Instead, she asked him a question that would haunt him for months to come. "What makes you think you can buy a soul?" Little did either of them know that this moment, this chance encounter between a billionaire and a homeless woman, would unfold into something far more profound than a simple business transaction. It would become a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, worth, and the true meaning of legacy. Before going further, if you are enjoying the story, like and subscribe the channel. The days that followed their first encounter were filled with careful negotiations, not just of money but of trust. Alexander found himself returning to the street corner where Sarah read to the children, watching from his car as she brought stories to life with nothing but her voice and her hands. He learned that she had once been a kindergarten teacher, before a series of medical bills for her late mother had stripped her of everything. What surprised Alexander most wasn't Sarah's past, it was her present. Despite living on the streets, she had created a makeshift library in an abandoned building, where homeless children could find refuge in books. She had turned her tragedy into someone else's hope. Each discovery about her made him more certain he had chosen right, even as it made him question everything he thought he knew about worth and value. Their meetings moved from the street corner to a small cafe, where Sarah would sip hot chocolate, never coffee, and ask him questions that no one had dared ask him before. "What will you teach this child about happiness?" she wondered one day, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. "Will you show them that it comes from a bank account, or will you show them it comes from something more?" Alexander found himself stammering, his usual boardroom confidence deserting him. For the first time in decades, someone was making him think about more than just his legacy, they were making him think about his life. Sarah wasn't just carrying his future child, she was carrying a mirror to his soul. But Sarah had her own demons to face. Each night, as she huddled in her usual spot, she wrestled with her decision. The money could change everything, not just for her but for all the children she helped. She could build a real shelter, a real library, give them all a chance at a better future. Yet something kept nagging at her, the look in Alexander's eyes when he talked about legacy. It wasn't just about having an heir, it was about having a second chance at life itself. The contract lay signed between them, a bridge and a barrier all at once. $1 million for 9 months, for one child, for one chance to rewrite both their stories. But as they sat across from each other in that cafe, both knew that whatever they were building went far beyond the ink and paper between them. "Tell me," Sarah said finally, picking up the pen, "if this child asks you one day why you chose me, what will you say?" Alexander looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the homeless woman the world had written off, but the soul who had taught him more about wealth in a few days than he had learned in a lifetime of making money. "I'll tell them," he said slowly, "that some people build empires of steel and glass, and some people build empires of hope. And that I wanted them to inherit both." Sarah's hand moved across the paper, her signature flowing like water. Neither of them knew it then, but they had just signed up for far more than a simple surrogacy. They had begun a journey that would reshape not just their lives, but their very understanding of what makes a family. The transition wasn't smooth. Alexander's world of penthouses and board meetings collided jarringly with Sarah's reality. His first move was to set her up in a luxury apartment, complete with a personal chef and housekeeping staff. Sarah refused. "I won't leave my kids," she said firmly, referring to the homeless children she helped. "They need their stories more than I need Egyptian cotton sheets." It was their first real conflict, and it shook Alexander's foundations. Here was a woman turning down the very comfort he thought everyone craved. Instead, she negotiated for something different, a small community center near her usual spot, where she could continue her work while maintaining a modest apartment upstairs. "This way," she explained, "we all win." The press got wind of their arrangement, of course. The headlines were brutal: Billionaire's designer baby deal with homeless woman and tech tycoon's desperate heir hunt. Alexander's PR team wanted to bury the story, but Sarah's response surprised everyone. She walked into his office one morning, newspaper in hand, and laid out a different strategy. "Let them talk," she said, her voice steady. "But let's show them something worth talking about." What followed was unexpected. Together, they launched a foundation focusing on homeless families and education. Alexander's money paired with Sarah's street-level knowledge created something extraordinary. While she carried his child, they built something else together. A network of shelters that doubled as learning centers, where homeless children could find not just food and beds, but books, computers, and hope. The medical appointments were another revelation. Alexander insisted on the best doctors, the most expensive clinics. But it was in these sterile, white-walled rooms that their dynamic began to shift. During one ultrasound, as the steady rhythm of the baby's heartbeat filled the room, Sarah noticed Alexander's hands trembling. This titan of industry, this man who commanded boardrooms with a glance, was fighting back tears at the sound of his child's heart. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. "I've spent my life building things that will outlast me," he whispered, eyes fixed on the monitor. "But this is different. This is really living beyond myself." But life has a way of testing our strongest convictions. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, complications arose. The doctors recommended complete bed rest, threatening the delicate balance she'd struck with her work at the community center. Alexander offered to hire staff to keep her programs running, but Sarah knew it wasn't the same. The children needed consistency, needed the security of familiar faces and voices. One rainy evening, Alexander found her sitting in the community center library, reading to a group of children despite her doctor's orders. He was about to interrupt to remind her of the risks when he stopped. She was reading The Little Prince, and her voice carried the weight of every word. "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye." He stood in the doorway, watching this woman who carried not just his child, but a wisdom he was only beginning to understand. The children sat around her, entranced, safe in the story she wove around them like a blanket. In that moment, Alexander realized that what he thought was a simple transaction, a child in exchange for money, had become something far more complex and beautiful. Before going further, if you are enjoying the story, like and subscribe the channel. The 6th month brought a storm that no one saw coming. Alexander's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Concerns were raised about the company's image, about his erratic behavior in focusing on homeless shelters instead of profit margins. Some board members had begun whispering about his fitness to lead, citing his illness as a reason for his questionable decisions. But it wasn't the board's threats that shook him. It was the late-night call from Sarah's doctor. Her blood pressure had spiked dangerously high, and she had been rushed to the hospital. Alexander found her there, pale against white sheets, still trying to coordinate activities at the community center from her hospital bed. "You need to stop," he said, more sharply than he intended. "The baby dash is not the only thing that matters," Sarah cut him off, her voice weak but determined. "Those children out there, they matter too. You of all people should understand not wanting to abandon your life's work." The words hit him like a physical blow. Wasn't that exactly what he was doing? Fighting to preserve his legacy, his life's work? But as he watched Sarah's determined efforts to keep her promises to those children, even from a hospital bed, he began to understand the difference. His legacy was about being remembered. Hers was about making a difference. That night, alone in his penthouse, Alexander made a decision that would shock the business world. He called an emergency press conference for the next morning. Without consulting his board or his PR team, he announced his intention to transition his company into a partially employee-owned enterprise, with a significant portion of profits dedicated to educational initiatives for underprivileged children. The stock market responded with immediate panic. His company's shares plummeted. Business commentators called it corporate suicide. But for the first time in his life, Alexander felt truly alive. He visited Sarah in the hospital, expecting to find her angry at the chaos he'd created. Instead, she was smiling. "You finally understand," she said softly. "Legacy isn't about control. It's about impact." But their moment of understanding was interrupted by a team of doctors rushing in. Sarah's condition had worsened. The baby was in distress. Emergency decisions needed to be made, priorities needed to be set. The doctors looked to Alexander as the contract holder, the legal decision-maker in this situation. He stood there, frozen, as the medical team rattled off statistics and scenarios. This was supposed to be a simple business transaction. Now he was being asked to make decisions that would affect not just his future child, but the life of a woman who had completely transformed his understanding of what really mattered. In that moment, looking at Sarah's pale face and the monitors tracking 2 precious heartbeats, Alexander Pierce, the man who had built an empire on quick decisions and calculated risks, found himself utterly unable to choose. Time seemed to stand still in that hospital room. The doctors' voices faded to a distant hum as Alexander looked at Sarah. She met his gaze with unwavering clarity, and in that moment she made the decision for both of them. "Save the baby," she whispered, her voice firm despite her weakness. "Promise me you'll make sure the community center continues. Promise me those children won't lose their safe haven." But Alexander Pierce, who had spent a lifetime making deals, broke his first promise to her. He turned to the doctors and said, "Save them both. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs. We're not losing anyone today." The next 12 hours were a blur of specialists, experimental treatments, and prayers from people who had long since stopped believing. The children from the community center gathered in the hospital waiting room, clutching books Sarah had read to them, refusing to leave. Alexander sat among them, listening as they took turns reading aloud, keeping Sarah's tradition alive even as she fought for her life. Something extraordinary happened in that waiting room. Alexander found himself surrounded by the true meaning of family, not bound by blood or contracts, but by love and shared purpose. These children, who had nothing in material terms, were rich in the very things he had spent his life missing. A young girl tugged at his sleeve, offering him her worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. "Miss Sarah says this one helps when you're scared," she said softly. Alexander took the book, his billion-dollar hands trembling as he opened it to the first page. As he read aloud, his voice grew stronger with each word. "Real isn't how you are made. It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with but really loves you, then you become real." The surgery lasted hours. Every specialist in the city had been called in, their services secured by Alexander's wealth but motivated by Sarah's spirit. News of her work with homeless children had spread through the hospital staff. They weren't just fighting to save a surrogate mother, they were fighting to save a beacon of hope. Finally, the lead surgeon emerged, exhausted but smiling. Both Sarah and the baby were stable. The experimental treatment had worked, though recovery would take time. Alexander felt his knees buckle with relief, catching himself on a nearby chair. But it was what the nurse said next that changed everything. "Mr. Pierce, there's something you need to know about the baby. We discovered something during the surgery that wasn't visible in earlier scans." The words that followed would challenge everything Alexander thought he knew about his carefully laid plans, about legacy, about what truly makes a family. As he stood there, surrounded by Sarah's makeshift family of homeless children, he realized that the greatest twist in this story was yet to come. Before going further, if you are enjoying the story, like and subscribe the channel. The nurse's revelation hit Alexander like a thunderbolt. The baby wasn't just a baby, it was twins. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Genetic testing performed during the emergency surgery revealed something impossible. One of the twins carried Alexander's rare genetic condition, while the other was completely healthy. "It's unprecedented," the specialist explained, showing him the test results. "We've never seen a case where identical twins have such different genetic markers. It's as if nature itself is teaching us a lesson about the randomness of life, about how two beings starting from the same point can have completely different destinies." Alexander stood by Sarah's bedside as she slowly regained consciousness. Her first words weren't about herself or even the babies, they were about the children at the center. "Did someone read to them today?" she asked weakly. "I did," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We read The Velveteen Rabbit." A small smile crossed her face. "Good choice. It's about becoming real through love. Then her eyes widened as she processed the news about the twins. Both of them, she said firmly before Alexander could speak. We protect both of them. But Alexander was already ahead of her. His time in that waiting room, surrounded by children who had nothing yet gave everything, had taught him more about love and worth than all his years in business. The idea that he had originally sought a perfect heir, untainted by his genetic condition, now seemed shallow and meaningless. He'd spent weeks in his private lab, working with the world's best genetic researchers, trying to ensure his heir wouldn't inherit his condition. Now, facing the reality of twins, one with and one without his condition, he realized that all his careful planning had led him to this moment of profound truth. Life couldn't be controlled, only cherished. I've been seeking immortality through legacy, he told Sarah, taking her hand. But these children, they're not about continuing my existence. They're about starting their own. Both of them exactly as they are. The news of the twins spread through the hospital, reaching the children from the community center who had refused to leave. They immediately began planning, discussing how they would read twice as many stories, make twice as many drawings. Their innocent enthusiasm brought tears to both Sarah and Alexander's eyes. But as Sarah rested and recovered, Alexander faced another battle. His board of directors had called another emergency meeting. The company's stock had stabilized after his announcement about employee ownership, but now they demanded answers about his plans for succession. They wanted assurances about the future, about which child would inherit his empire. Alexander walked into that boardroom different from the man he'd been just months before. He looked at the faces around the table, ambitious, calculating, focused on preservation of wealth above all else. He'd been just like them until Sarah showed him a different way to measure worth. Standing before his board of directors, Alexander Pierce did something unprecedented. He told the truth. Gentlemen, I called this meeting not to discuss which child will inherit my position, but to announce the complete restructuring of how this company will operate moving forward. The boardroom erupted in chaos, but Alexander continued, his voice steady and clear. We've built an empire on the idea that worth can be measured in dollars and market share. I'm here to tell you that we've been wrong. Dead wrong. He clicked a remote, and behind him appeared photos of the community center, of children reading, of lives being transformed. This, he said, pointing to the images, is real wealth. And it's time our company reflected that reality. His new proposal was radical, the creation of a dual leadership structure. The company would be led not by a single CEO, but by two co-leaders, one focusing on business operations, the other on social impact. Neither of his children would automatically inherit his position. They would have to earn it, not through wealth or genetic lottery, but through demonstrating their understanding of both profit and purpose. But your condition, one board member protested. We need to ensure stable leadership. My condition, Alexander interrupted, has taught me more about leadership than any business school ever could. It taught me that time is precious, and how we use it matters more than how long we have it. One of my children will face the same challenge I do. The other won't. But both will have the opportunity to learn what really matters in building a legacy. As the board members sat in stunned silence, Alexander revealed his final move. He had already transferred controlling interest in the company to a newly created trust. The trust's board would include not just business leaders, but also community representatives, education experts, and yes, even some of the formerly homeless individuals whose lives had been transformed by Sarah's work. This isn't about protecting my name, he declared. It's about protecting what matters. Every child in our community centers will have access to education, healthcare, and opportunities, including both of my children regardless of their genetic makeup. The corporate lawyers scrambled, the board members protested, but Alexander stood firm. In the end, it wasn't his wealth that gave him power in that room, it was his unwavering conviction in what he now knew to be true, that real legacy isn't built in boardrooms, but in the lives we touch and the changes we inspire. Back in the hospital, Sarah listened as Alexander recounted the board meeting. She held both babies, one in each arm, seeing no difference between them despite what their genes might say. You know, she said softly, these children will have something far more valuable than money or perfect health. They'll have a father who learned to see with his heart. Alexander looked at his unconventional family, a former homeless woman who had become his greatest teacher, twin babies who had destroyed his careful plans and given him something far better, and through the window he could see the children from the community center, still keeping their vigil, still sharing their stories. Before going further, if you are enjoying the story, like and subscribe the channel. The media exploded with news of Alexander's decision. Business analysts called it revolutionary, critics called it naive, but the story that caught the public's imagination wasn't about corporate restructuring, it was about the twins. The idea of one child carrying the genetic condition while the other didn't sparked intense debate about fate, fairness, and the true meaning of inheritance. Sarah's recovery was slow but steady. During this time, Alexander practically moved into the hospital, setting up a makeshift office in the corner of her room. He split his time between managing the company's transition, caring for the twins, and helping Sarah coordinate activities at the community center via video calls. The twins, a boy and a girl, were thriving despite their early dramatic entrance into the world. Alexander named the boy Thomas, after his own father who had taught him his first lessons about business. Sarah named the girl Hope because, as she said, that's what she represents for all of us. It was Hope who carried Alexander's genetic condition, while Thomas was free of it. One evening, as they watched the twins sleeping in their hospital bassinets, Sarah noticed Alexander studying Hope with an intensity that worried her. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking about time," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "About how I wanted an heir to carry on after I'm gone, but now..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Now I have a daughter who might face the same shortened timeline I do. Everything I feared for myself, I now fear for her." Sarah reached for his hand. "You're looking at it wrong," she said. "You're seeing time as an enemy. But look at what you've done with your time since you learned about your condition. You've transformed your company, created opportunities for hundreds of children, built something meaningful. Hope won't just inherit your condition. She'll inherit that legacy of making every moment count." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. The children from the community center had organized a surprise. They had created a massive mural on the wall opposite Sarah's hospital window. It depicted a sprawling tree, its branches reaching toward the sky, with books instead of leaves. At the base of the tree were painted figures of all sizes, some in business suits, some in tattered clothes, all reaching up toward the books. "See?" Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "That's real inheritance. Not money, not genes, but the power to inspire others to grow." Thomas and Hope grew stronger each day, already showing distinct personalities. Thomas was quiet and observant, while Hope was more expressive, already reaching out to grab fingers and responding to voices. The nurses noted how they seemed to calm each other, how they'd fuss less when placed side by side. Alexander watched them, seeing not a blessed child and a cursed one, but two perfect pieces of a larger puzzle. He thought about his own father, who had taught him that business was about winning at all costs. How different these twins' lessons would be. They would learn that true victory often looks nothing like what you initially imagined. As Sarah's discharge date approached, Alexander faced an unexpected dilemma. The contract they'd signed months ago suddenly felt insignificant, almost insulting. The idea of Sarah simply handing over the twins and walking away with her $1 million seemed unthinkable. But he struggled to find the words to express what he really wanted. The community center had flourished in Sarah's absence, run by a combination of professional staff and older street kids who'd stepped up to help. But everyone knew it wasn't the same without her. The children would ask daily when Miss Sarah and the babies were coming home, not just Sarah but the babies too. In their minds, this had already become a family. One afternoon, as Alexander sat in Sarah's hospital room working on his laptop, she finally broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "So," she said, looking out the window, "I've been thinking about the contract." Alexander's heart stopped for a moment. Before he could speak, she continued, "I want to tear it up. Sarah, the money is yours, you've more than earned it. She turned to face him, her eyes clear and determined. "This was never about the money, Alexander. You know that now. These past months, what we've built, it's worth more than any contract." He looked at the twins sleeping peacefully in their bassinets. Thomas's tiny hand was reached out, touching Hope's blanket, as if making sure his sister was still there. "I've been thinking too," Alexander said slowly. "About family, about legacy, about love." Sarah watched him carefully as he struggled to find the right words. The billionaire who could command a boardroom was stumbling over what his heart needed to say. "The children at the center," he finally continued, "they don't just need the programs and the education. They need what you've given them. They need someone who sees their worth, who believes in their potential. And Hope and Thomas, they need that too. They need you." Tears formed in Sarah's eyes as she understood what he was trying to say. "Alexander, stay," he said simply. "Not as a surrogate, not as an employee, but as their mother. As..." He paused, gathering his courage, "as my partner in everything. In raising them, in running the foundation, in showing them what really matters in life." The room fell silent except for the soft breathing of the twins. Outside, the sunset painted the city in shades of gold, illuminating the mural the children had created. The tree with its books for leaves seemed to glow with possibility. Sarah looked at the babies, at the man who had transformed from a business tycoon into someone capable of true love, at the life they had inadvertently built together. "We'll need to renovate the community center," she said finally. "Add a proper living space upstairs. For all of us." Alexander smiled, understanding everything she wasn't saying. Sometimes the greatest contracts aren't written on paper, but in the spaces between hearts. Before going further, if you are enjoying the story, like and subscribe the channel. The transition from hospital to home wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of moving into Alexander's penthouse, they all relocated to the renovated community center. The top floor was transformed into a warm, welcoming living space, while the lower floors remained dedicated to the children's programs. It was unconventional, but it was perfect for their unconventional family. The news of their arrangement sparked another media frenzy. This time, though, the headlines were different. Billionaire chooses love over legacy, and tech tycoon redefines family values. Their story had captured the public's imagination, not for its scandal but for its humanity. Alexander's board members were initially skeptical about his choice to live above a community center. But during their first board meeting held in the center's conference room, something unexpected happened. The sound of children reading and laughing drifted up from the floors below, and Hope and Thomas, now 3 months old, were brought in briefly by Sarah. The sight of Alexander cradling Hope while discussing quarterly projections changed the atmosphere in the room. "I used to think power meant having the highest office in the tallest building," Alexander told them. "Now I know it means being close enough to the ground to lift others up." Sarah's influence extended beyond the community center. She began attending company meetings, not as Alexander's partner, but as the foundation's director. Her street-level experience and practical wisdom brought a new perspective to corporate decisions. When one executive complained about the cost of expanding their educational programs, Sarah silently handed him a worn copy of The Little Prince. The message was clear. Sometimes the most important things can't be measured in dollars. The twins continued to grow, each developing their own distinct personality. Thomas was methodical, studying everything with intense concentration. Hope was a burst of energy, already trying to reach out to everyone who came near her. Their different genetic destinies seemed to matter less and less as their unique spirits emerged. One evening, as they sat on their rooftop garden overlooking the city, Sarah noticed Alexander looking at some medical papers. "New research?" she asked, knowing he had teams working on treatments for his condition, and now hopes. "Yes," he replied, but his voice was lighter than usual. "But that's not why I'm smiling. Look at this." He handed her the papers. They were drawings and letters from children at the center, each one expressing their dreams for the future. One wanted to be a doctor to help people like Hope. Another wanted to build community centers all over the world. "This," Alexander said, pulling Hope and Thomas closer, "this is the treatment I never knew I needed. The cure for a life focused on all the wrong things." Sarah watched as the setting sun painted the city gold, just like that day in the hospital. The mural on the wall had been joined by others, turning their building into a beacon of color in the neighborhood. From their rooftop, they could see other community centers being built across the city, each one a branch of their growing tree of hope. Time moved forward, and the twins celebrated their first birthday surrounded by an extraordinary mix of people. Corporate executives mingled with formerly homeless families, all gathered in the community center's main hall. The party was a testament to how much had changed in a year, not just for Alexander and Sarah, but for everyone their story had touched. Hope, despite carrying her father's genetic condition, was thriving. She had inherited not just Alexander's DNA, but Sarah's infectious spirit. Her laugh would fill the community center halls, drawing people to her like a magnet. Thomas, quiet but perceptive, had developed an uncanny ability to calm his sister when she was upset, as if their bond transcended their genetic differences. Alexander's health had its ups and downs, but his perspective on time had shifted completely. Instead of seeing each day as a countdown, he saw it as an opportunity. He threw himself into research for treatments, not just for himself and Hope, but for others with similar conditions. The company's medical research division had become a leader in genetic therapy, driven by a purpose far more personal than profit. Sarah's role had evolved too. She'd become a respected voice in discussions about urban poverty and education. The reading program she'd started on a street corner had grown into a nationwide initiative. But she never lost touch with her roots, Every evening she still read stories to the children at the center, now with Hope and Thomas on her lap. One evening during story time, a new child arrived at the center. She was clutching a worn teddy bear and wouldn't speak to anyone. Sarah recognized the look in her eyes, the same lost look she'd had during her own time on the streets. But before Sarah could approach, Hope crawled over to the girl and offered her favorite book, while Thomas quietly sat beside them, creating a space of safety without words. Alexander watched from the doorway, witnessing his children instinctively doing what had taken him decades to learn, seeing the worth in every soul, regardless of circumstances. The sight brought tears to his eyes, and he felt Sarah's hand slip into his. "They get it," she whispered. "They really get it." That night, after the children had gone home and the twins were asleep, Alexander and Sarah sat in their rooftop garden. The city lights twinkled below them, and the warm summer air carried the scent of the herbs they'd planted together. "Remember when you asked me if I could buy a soul?" Alexander mused, looking at Sarah. "I was such a fool. I thought I was buying an heir, but instead—" He paused, overcome with emotion. "Instead, you found your heart," Sarah finished for him, squeezing his hand. Before going further, if you are enjoying the story, like and subscribe the channel. The research into genetic therapy was progressing faster than anyone had expected. Alexander's resources, combined with his personal stake in the outcome, had accelerated breakthroughs that seemed impossible just months earlier. But it was a conversation with 3-year-old Hope that truly changed everything. "Daddy," she asked one evening, looking up from her picture book, "why do you look sad when you look at me sometimes?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. He hadn't realized his concern for her future had been so visible. Before he could answer, Thomas, ever perceptive, moved closer to his sister and said, "Dad's not sad, Hope. He just loves you extra." Sarah, who had been listening from the doorway, watched as Alexander gathered both children in his arms. "I'm not sad," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud. So proud of both of you." That night, after the children were asleep, Alexander made a decision. He called an emergency board meeting, but this time, it wasn't in a corporate boardroom. He gathered the board members in the community center's library, surrounded by books and children's artwork. "We've been approaching this all wrong," he announced. "We've been trying to fix what we see as broken, instead of celebrating what makes each person unique. Yes, Hope and I have a condition that may shorten our lives. But it's not a curse, it's a different way of experiencing time." The company's medical research shifted its focus. Instead of just seeking a cure, they began developing ways to enhance quality of life for people with genetic conditions. The breakthrough came not in eliminating the condition, but in managing its effects while celebrating the unique perspectives it brought. Hope, now approaching her 4th birthday, had become the unofficial mascot of the research team. Her resilience and joy inspired the scientists to think differently about their work. She didn't need to be fixed, she needed to be supported in being exactly who she was. Thomas, meanwhile, had developed an extraordinary empathy for others facing health challenges. At just 4 years old, he could often be found reading to sick children in the hospital ward where the research was conducted. His quiet strength complemented Hope's vibrant spirit perfectly. Sarah watched all of this with a mother's pride and a teacher's wisdom. The community center had grown into a network of centers across the country, each one combining education with medical support and community building. The model they'd created was being studied by organizations worldwide. One day, a journalist asked Sarah if she ever regretted her decision to sign that contract years ago. She looked around at the center full of laughing children, at Hope teaching younger kids to read despite her occasional health challenges, at Thomas quietly supporting everyone in his own way, at Alexander, the man who had learned that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars. On the twins' 5th birthday, Alexander and Sarah organized a celebration that would change lives forever. Instead of a traditional party, they hosted the grand opening of the Hope and Thomas Institute, a revolutionary center combining medical research, education, and community support. The building stood adjacent to their original community center, its architecture a blend of modern science and welcoming warmth. The timing wasn't coincidental. 5 years ago, doctors had given Alexander less than 5 years to live. Yet here he stood, not just surviving but thriving, thanks to the treatments developed through their research. His condition wasn't cured, but it was managed in a way that allowed him to focus on living rather than dying. Hope, now a vibrant 5-year-old, cut the ribbon with her brother. She wore a bright yellow dress that matched her personality, while Thomas stood beside her in a neat blue suit, looking every bit the protective brother. The crowd gathered for the opening included medical researchers, community members, corporate leaders, and families affected by genetic conditions. 5 years ago, Alexander began his speech, his voice strong and clear. I thought I was looking for an heir. Instead, I found a family. I found love. I found purpose. And most importantly, I found out that what we often see as our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths. Sarah stepped up beside him, adding her own perspective. When a billionaire approached me on the street 5 years ago, I thought he was crazy, she said, earning gentle laughter from the crowd. Now I know he was crazy enough to believe that love could transform not just 2 lives, but an entire community. The institute represented everything they had learned over the past 5 years. One floor was dedicated to medical research, where scientists worked on improving treatments for genetic conditions. Another floor housed educational facilities, where children of all backgrounds could learn and grow together. The top floor was a community space, where families could find support, share experiences, and build connections. Hope had insisted on a special reading room, filled with books about different kinds of families and different kinds of strength. Thomas had helped design quiet spaces throughout the building, understanding that sometimes people just needed a peaceful place to be themselves. During the celebration, a small girl approached Hope. She had the same genetic condition, and her parents had been told she might not live a full life. Hope took her hand and led her to the reading room. "Want to know a secret?" she whispered. "The doctors told my dad the same thing, but he learned that they were wrong about what makes a life full." Thomas followed them, carrying a stack of books. He didn't say much, but his presence provided the quiet support that had become his trademark. Together, the twins showed this girl what their parents had learned, that life's value isn't measured in years, but in moments of love and connection. Before going further, if you are enjoying the story, like and subscribe the channel. As the day of celebration continued, Alexander found himself drawn to the original community center next door. He walked through its familiar halls, now lined with 5 years of memories. The mural of the tree with books for leaves had been joined by countless other artworks, each telling a story of transformation and hope. In the main reading room, he found Sarah sitting in her old reading chair, running her fingers over the worn arms. "Remember when you thought this chair wasn't good enough?" she teased, referring to his initial attempts to replace everything with expensive new furniture. "I remember thinking a lot of things weren't good enough," he replied softly. "I was wrong about all of them." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of singing. Following the melody, they found Hope and Thomas in the newly connected walkway between the institute and the community center. Hope was teaching a group of children one of the songs Sarah used to sing on the streets, while Thomas orchestrated a quiet art project for those who preferred less noisy activities. Watching their children, Alexander and Sarah saw the perfect blend of both their worlds. Hope had inherited Sarah's ability to create joy in any circumstance, while Thomas had Alexander's gift for seeing the potential in quiet moments. Neither child lived in the shadow of Hope's genetic condition. Instead, they both lived in the light of possibility. A group of reporters had gathered for the institute's opening, eager to document the latest chapter in what they called the Billionaire's redemption story. But they missed the real story that was unfolding in small moments throughout the day. A former board member reading to homeless children, a leading genetic researcher collaborating with a street artist on a mural about diversity, children with various medical conditions playing together without a thought to their differences. Late in the afternoon, Alexander received news that the latest clinical trials had shown unprecedented success. The treatment they had developed wasn't just managing symptoms, it was significantly extending life expectancy for people with his and Hope's condition. But as he watched his daughter enthusiastically explaining her favorite book to a new friend, he realized something profound. They had already achieved immortality, not through medical breakthroughs, but through the lives they had touched and changed. Sarah found him standing in his old office, now converted into a teen mentoring space. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, using the phrase she'd often used during their early days together. "I was just thinking about legacy," he replied, watching as Hope and Thomas organized a spontaneous storytime session in the courtyard below. "Not the kind I was looking for 5 years ago, but the kind we built together." As the sun began to set on this momentous day, the institute received an unexpected visitor. A woman in an expensive suit walked through the doors, her presence immediately drawing attention. She was Claire Pierce, Alexander's estranged sister, who had cut ties with him years ago when he'd first started throwing away the family fortune on his community projects. Claire stood in the entrance, taking in the scene before her. The last time she'd spoken to her brother, she called him a fool for choosing this path. Now, 5 years later, she was here to see for herself what had become of the Pierce legacy. Hope was the first to notice her aunt, though they'd never met. Something in the woman's stance, so similar to her father's old corporate posture, caught her attention. Without hesitation, Hope approached her, offering her hand the way she'd seen her father do countless times. "Welcome to our home," Hope said, her smile bright and genuine. "Would you like to hear a story?" Thomas, sensing the tension in the air, quietly appeared beside his sister. His presence, as always, had a calming effect on everyone around him. Claire found herself looking between the twins, seeing echoes of her brother in both their faces, but something else too, a warmth that the Pierce family had never possessed. Sarah recognized Claire from old photos and media coverage. She stepped forward, ready to protect her children if necessary, but what she saw in Claire's eyes wasn't hostility, it was loss, and perhaps a hint of regret. Alexander emerged from his office and stopped short at the sight of his sister. 5 years of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and missed opportunities. But before he could speak, Hope had already taken her aunt's hand and was leading her toward the reading room. "This is where we learn that every story matters," Hope explained, her voice carrying the same conviction her mother once used on street corners. "Even the scary ones, even the sad ones. Because that's how we learn to make them better." Claire Pierce, who had spent years judging her brother's choices from afar, found herself sitting in a reading circle with children from all walks of life, listening to her niece read a story about second chances and the courage to change. Before going further, if you are enjoying the story, like and subscribe the channel. Claire sat in the reading circle, her designer suit out of place among the casual warmth of the room, as Hope finished her story. The other children had slowly drifted away, leaving just the family. Thomas had positioned himself between his aunt and his sister, his protective instincts as sharp as ever. "You have father's eyes," Claire finally said to Thomas, breaking the silence. "But you," she turned to Hope, "you have his spirit. The way he used to be before." She trailed off, lost in memories. "Before money became more important than moments?" Sarah supplied gently, causing Claire to look up sharply. But there was no judgment in Sarah's voice, only understanding. Alexander watched this interaction from the doorway, memories flooding back. Claire had been the one who'd fought hardest to maintain their father's business-first philosophy after his death. She'd seen Alexander's transformation as a betrayal of everything they'd been taught. "The company's stock is up 300% since you implemented the dual leadership model," Claire said suddenly, her voice professional. "Your social impact initiatives have generated more positive press than our entire previous marketing budget. And this medical research." She gestured at the institute around them. "It's revolutionary." "But that's not why you're here," Alexander said softly, knowing his sister. Claire's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "No," she whispered. "I'm here because—" She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a medical report. "My daughter, Emma. She has the same condition. The doctors found it last month." The revelation hung in the air. Hope, with a child's innocent wisdom, immediately took her aunt's hand. "Then she's like me and Daddy," she said brightly. "We're special." Thomas quietly left the room and returned moments later with his favorite book about genetic differences, the one that had helped him understand his sister's condition. He placed it in Claire's lap without a word. Sarah watched as Claire's professional facade crumbled completely. This powerful businesswoman, who had once denounced their entire way of life, was now facing the same fear that had driven Alexander to that street corner 5 years ago. "The treatments we've developed," Alexander began, moving closer to his sister. "They're not just managing symptoms anymore. Hope is proof of that. And now with the new research—" But Claire interrupted him, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't come for the treatments, Alex. Well, not just for them. I came because—" She looked around the room at the children's artwork on the walls, at the well-worn books, at the family her brother had built. "I came because I need to learn how to do this. How to build something meaningful out of something scary. How to turn fear into hope." In the days that followed Claire's arrival, the Institute saw another transformation unfold. Claire brought her daughter Emma, a quiet 7-year-old who shared Hope's condition but none of her confidence. Emma had grown up in the privileged world Claire and Alexander had left behind, where appearances mattered most and imperfections were hidden away. Hope took to her cousin immediately, showing her around the Institute with the expertise of someone who had made every corner her own. "This is where we do art therapy," she explained, leading Emma to a bright room filled with paintings. "Sometimes when words are hard, colors help." Thomas, recognizing a kindred quiet spirit in Emma, shared his favorite hiding spots: the window seat behind the library's reference section, the peaceful corner of the rooftop garden where butterflies gathered. Slowly, Emma began to emerge from her shell. Claire watched in amazement as her daughter, who had barely spoken since her diagnosis, began to laugh again. "I've been so focused on finding a cure," she confessed to Sarah one afternoon, "that I forgot to let her live." Sarah understood this better than anyone. "It's not about how long the story is," she said, echoing words she'd once told Alexander. "It's about how beautiful we make each page." The real breakthrough came during a group session for families affected by genetic conditions. Claire, accustomed to boardrooms and business meetings, found herself sitting in a circle with parents from all walks of life, each facing the same fears she harbored. A homeless father spoke about how the institute had given his daughter not just medical care but dignity. A single mother shared how the community had become her support system. Each story chipped away at Claire's old prejudices, replacing them with understanding. Alexander watched his sister's transformation with a mixture of joy and regret. "We lost so many years," he said one evening as they sat in his office, looking at old family photos. "We were taught that the Pierce legacy was about empire building," Claire replied, touching a photo of their father. "But looking at what you've created here, this is what father's work should have become. Not just successful but meaningful." The next board meeting was unlike any before it. Claire, who had maintained her position as head of the Pierce Family Trust, announced a complete restructuring. The trust would now work in harmony with Alexander's initiatives, creating a model that balanced profit with purpose. Emma found her place among the Institute's children, no longer the isolated heiress but part of a community that celebrated differences. Her medical treatments progressed well, but more importantly, her spirit flourished. Like Hope, she learned that her condition was not a limitation but a unique lens through which to view the world. 10 years had passed since that fateful day when Alexander Pierce met Sarah on a street corner. The Institute had grown beyond anyone's imagining, with branches in cities worldwide. But it was on this anniversary that the most extraordinary twist in their story would unfold. During the decade celebration ceremony, an elderly man in worn clothes appeared at the Institute's doors. He was James Collins, Sarah's long-lost father, who had abandoned her family when she was young. He had seen her on television speaking about the Institute's work, and had finally found the courage to face his past. Sarah froze when she saw him, the weight of childhood memories rushing back. But before she could react, Hope, now 15 and wise beyond her years, stepped forward. "You're our grandfather," she said simply. "Would you like to hear our story?" Thomas, ever protective, stood close to his mother, while Emma moved to Hope's side. The three teenagers, bound by blood and circumstance, formed a united front that bridged the gap between past and present. Meanwhile, the medical research department had made a groundbreaking discovery. The gene therapy they developed wasn't just treating the condition, it was showing signs of reversing it. Hope and Emma had been responding remarkably well, but the real surprise came from testing other genetic conditions. The therapy seemed to have applications far beyond what they'd imagined. Claire, who had become an integral part of the Institute's leadership, organized a global health summit to share their findings. But during the preparations, she uncovered something shocking in the old Pierce family records. Their father had known about the genetic condition all along. He had funded initial research but abandoned it when it threatened his profit margins. This revelation could have reopened old wounds, but instead, it strengthened their resolve. Alexander and Claire decided to release all their research freely to the world, removing patents and profit barriers. The Pierce fortune would be dedicated to making treatment accessible to everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. The story took another turn when one of the original street children Sarah had read to returned, now a medical student determined to join the Institute's research team. Maria Rodriguez had lived under bridges with her mother, finding hope in Sarah's stories. Now she was developing new therapeutic approaches combining traditional medicine with the power of narrative and community. As the Institute celebrated its decade of work, the courtyard was filled with thousands of people whose lives had been touched by this unconventional family. James Collins stood among them, watching his daughter lead a global movement of healing and hope. The homeless father who had once doubted his worth now directed outreach programs across the country. Emma, once isolated in her privilege, ran support groups for teenagers facing similar challenges. Alexander, his condition now stabilized by the very treatments his institute had developed, stood before the crowd. 10 years ago, I thought I was looking for an heir to my fortune, he began. Instead, I found something far more precious. I found the truth about what makes us truly rich. Hope stepped forward, her voice strong and clear. We all have something the world calls a weakness. But weakness is just strength waiting to be understood. Every person here has a story that matters, a gift that's needed, a purpose that's vital to the world? Thomas, who had grown into a quiet but powerful force in the Institute's educational programs, added, "Our differences aren't barriers to success, they're bridges to understanding." The final surprise came when Sarah revealed their newest initiative, a worldwide network of storytelling centers, where people facing any kind of challenge could find their voice and their value. The centers would combine medical care, education, and community support, all built on the foundation of human dignity and worth. As the sun set on this remarkable day, the extended Pierce family, biological and chosen, wealthy and poor, healthy and sick, gathered in the original reading room where it all began. James Collins, seeking forgiveness, shared his own story for the first time. Claire's business acumen had transformed their model of compassionate care into a sustainable global movement. Maria's medical innovations were revolutionizing treatment approaches. The moral of their story echoed across the world. True wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the lives we touch. Real family isn't defined by blood but by love. And our greatest challenges, when embraced with courage and compassion, become our greatest gifts to the world. Each person's life is a story waiting to be told, each challenge a chance to create something beautiful, and every heart has the capacity to transform pain into purpose. In the end, the most precious inheritance we can leave isn't money or power, but the impact we have on others and the love we share along the way. In that reading room, surrounded by books and memories, Hope picked up The Little Prince, the same copy Sarah had read on the streets so many years ago. As she began to read, her voice carried the wisdom of their journey. "Here is my secret. It is very simple. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye." If you enjoyed the story, like and subscribe the channel.